Welcome to this webinar on POPI. We hope that we can give you some valuable insight today on how the compliance risk management cycle may be used to enhance your POPI risk management. Although the Act was promulgated in 2013, the announcement of an effective date for POPI in June last year has certainly elevated it to one of the hottest business topics of 2021. Chances are therefore very good that your organization has spent the last 12 months reviewing and adopting extensive POPI mitigation measures in order to show compliance with the Act on the 1st of July when it becomes effective. But what happens when the 1st of July has come and gone? How will your organization know that what has been put in place will be good enough? Here enters the discipline of compliance risk management. By definition, compliance risk management refers to the practice of identifying potential risk in advance, analyzing them, and taking precautionary steps to reduce or curb the risk. After all, even with unlimited budget and resources, which you'll never have anyway, no company can achieve perfect compliance with all regulatory burdens at all times. Some mistakes are bound to happen eventually. The goal is to reduce the operational risk of non-compliance down to acceptable levels to your board and your regulators. Compliance risk management is the art of managing the risk of non-compliance as best as possible, given the resources your compliance program has and the regulatory obligations your company faces. As global regulations and accessibility grow, so does compliance risk for businesses. Depending on the sector in which you operate, both internal and external rules and regulations will dictate what your business can and cannot do, as well as what you need to be aware of while managing everyday operations. Failure to comply with such regulations can result in detrimental effects for your business, ranging from financial penalties and can even go so far as imprisonment. That's why, when it comes to compliance risk, ignorance is certainly not bliss. So how do we address compliance and specifically POPI compliance? Over the last couple of months, I have seen a number of different documents and templates being advertised and circulated as being the solution to POPI compliance. However, as you might guess, companies can achieve practical, effective compliance risk management in any number of ways. One doesn't buy a standard issue compliance risk management program that can fit all firms across all industries. You build one based on your firm's own business processes, employees, and regulatory compliance concerns. So the question to ask about compliance risk management isn't where do I get that or does ours comply? The question you should be asking is what should our POPI compliance risk management program do? The answer to that is very simple, regardless of the regulatory problem in question. The program must assist the organization to identify the areas of regulatory risk that needs to be addressed. You will see on my cycle graph that is the first step in the process. As part of the identification, the organization must be able to assess the risk of non-compliance. The second thing that your program should do is to include a system of mitigation actions by which the organization addresses the risk in accordance with a system of prioritization. The program should provide for monitoring of the effectiveness of the mitigation protocols by reducing the likelihood or impact of risk. And lastly, the program must include a cycle of review and improvement of the different phases. So it's clear from the above that a risk management program requires a system of continuous improvement. Whilst it would be ideal if we could devise a program that is wholly sufficient the first time, POPI will be a very good example in practice how what we have designed and implemented the first time round may not remain sufficient or effective over time. Continuous improvement and change management is essential in ensuring the ongoing achievement of greatest values from all risk management framework elements, including the process, capability, behaviors, tools and templates, and reporting structures, and the practices used to manage risk while making decisions effectively and efficiently. First phase, identify the risk. So the very first step is to identify the risk. The POPI legislation and its regulations stipulate a number of matters which a responsible party and operators need to comply with. Your organization would have, as part of its phase, looked at some of the following key elements. Who are the POPI data subjects in our organization? Do we process their personal information, or do we process information on behalf of another organization? What type of personal information do we process? What processing activities do we undertake? And why do we undertake these activities? So in other words, to determine the purpose of processing. What safeguards do we have in place to manage the security of personal information? What relationships are in place that affect the processing of personal information? And what agreements or consents or disclosures do I need to implement in my relationship with our data subjects and other responsible parties? The second step when identifying regulatory risk is to assess or rate the risk. If you've done a thorough job of identifying the risk, so in other words, listing all of the requirements that your organization must comply with, you may end up with a long and very overwhelming list. Because every organization has limited resources to apply to the mitigation of these new regulatory requirements, the organization will need to assess what risks non-compliance or even compliance with the provisions may have on the organization. This is referred to as risk rating. The risk that a compliance holds for an organization consists of two twin elements. The first component of a risk assessment is determining the consequence of non-compliance, and secondly, determining the probability of non-compliance. The consequence of regulatory non-compliance can broadly be classed as legal impact. These are regulations that can be used against the organization with failure to comply, which could result in fines, imprisonments, product seizures, penalties, or debarment. The second consequence is financial impact. This is the outcomes of non-compliance that affect the business's bottom line, loss of investor confidence, share prices, or potential future earnings. The third type of consequence is reputational impact. These are any results that affect customer perception of a brand via bad PR, decreased employee confidence, or customer trust. The last type of consequence is business impact. These are factors that affect a business's ability to operate, like a suspension of the organization's license to conduct business. Within each of these consequences, there are different levels of impact for the organization, which will affect its ratings. For example, there are different levels of corrective actions which may be applied by a regulator. The lowest may be an administrative inquiry, and the highest may be the issuing of a decision for jail time against directors of the organization. So under the consequence legal impact, you might have a low, medium, and high risk rating according to possible legal consequences. The second component by which we use to measure risk is probability. So in other words, what is the chance that an event of non-compliance will occur in the organization? By combining the factors of consequence and probability, the organization can more reasonably start to plan its risk strategies. For example, if non-compliance has an extremely high consequence, but the likelihood of ever occurring in the organization is very low, the risk rating for that factor will only be a medium rating. Based on the priority risks identified, their drivers or root causes, and their susceptibility to measurement, the next step requires that management choose the appropriate risk response. In other words, phase 2 is the development of risk mitigation strategies or appropriate risk responses. Risk responses generally includes avoidance. So avoidance is eliminating a specific threat, usually by eliminating the cause. Your organization may decide, for example, that a specific method of marketing carries too much POPI risk for insufficient reward and may decide to stop pursuing new business by that avenue. An organization first decides whether to accept or reject a risk based on an assessment of whether the risk is desirable or undesirable. A desirable risk is one that is inherent in the entity's business model or normal future operations and that the company believes it can monitor and manage effectively. An undesirable risk is one that is off strategy, offers unattractive rewards, or cannot be monitored or managed effectively. Acceptance is accepting the consequence of a risk. This is often accomplished by developing a contingency plan to execute should the risk event occur. The reporting process prescribed under POPI is a very good example of this. There is not much that an organization can do when a data subject requires certain information about the processing activities of the organization. The organization just simply needs to comply with those requirements and move on. The third type of risk response is to transfer the risk. An organization can transfer the risk of regulatory compliance by insuring against the event or by outsourcing functions to other organizations who are more adept at handling the requirements. Many organizations have dealt with a large portion of their POPI obligations by outsourcing the technical safeguarding mechanisms to specialist organizations. The last type of risk response is mitigation. Mitigation is the most common and critical component of the risk response. Mitigation is the development and implementation of plans or rules to reduce the expected monetary value of a risk event by reducing the probability of occurrence. In the POPI universe, these typically include revised data subject engagement processes around marketing, communication, and privacy, revised HR policies that provide for enhanced training and consequences for breaches in confidentiality and security protocols, enhanced information security policies and disaster management strategies, and due diligences on and a revision of service provider relationships. When the organization has decided which risk management strategies will be the most effective and affordable for the organization given their risk rating, then the organization should practically outline the steps and decide who is responsible for each step in the risk management plan. It should communicate the plan and ensure that there is buy-in from all who are involved in the organization, for example, staff, stakeholders, and service providers, and provide training for all staff so that they understand the rationale of a risk management plan as well as the expectations, procedures, forms, etc. Once the organization has identified its regulatory risks and has documented and implemented a response to those risks, it will need to implement a plan by which the effectiveness and appropriateness of the risk responses are monitored. The first step in being able to monitor compliance is by assigning oversight obligations to key members of the organization. The key role play in the monitoring of POPI compliance lies with the information officer. The information officer may outsource some or all of his duties to deputy information officers. How many of these individuals are needed within the organization shall be dependent on the size of the organization, the complexity of the business, and the level of risks to which it is exposed. These individuals should all be tasked with oversight of activities of which they have specialist knowledge. It is vital, therefore, that before these individuals can be required to oversee POPI compliance, they first are brought on the same page in respect of the identification and mitigation steps we discussed before. Now, how will they monitor compliance? There's a number of techniques for monitoring compliance. 4 of these techniques include the following. The first is use of policy. An organization devises and documents approaches to auditing financial statements. For example, these policies will ensure that the organization is not breaching government regulations and health and safety regulations, for example. Monitoring the application and enforcement of these policies will ensure compliance with these regulations. The second is use of standard operating procedures. Having standard operating procedures ensures that employees, old or new, follow these procedures whenever they perform an activity for which these procedures have been developed. By checking off every step of the standard operating procedures and recording each activity, compliance of staff with the procedures can be monitored. This will ensure the activities of staff are always of high quality and consistent with stipulated rules and standards. The third way to monitor is by the use of technology. Automation of an organization's internal processes reduces human error. It also facilitates the monitoring of these processes via inbuilt quality control computer systems that flag accuracy issues. Automation improves an organization's prospects of monitoring its compliance with stipulated standards. Models, risk analytics, and web-enabled technologies make it possible to aggregate information about risks using common data elements to support the creation of a risk management dashboard or scorecards for use by risk owners, unit managers, and executive management. Dashboards and scorecard reporting should be flexible enough to enable the design of reports to address specific needs, including reporting to the board of directors. Monitoring also includes activities of an internal or external audit function or compliance testing. This is the practice of conducting audits on current processes to find out whether people are following compliance requirements or if there is a problem with a particular process. It's performed by the compliance department or by external audit function, which is tasked through a process of independent sampling to review the compliance with internal controls. The last phase in effective regulatory risk management is to constantly review the risk management program through any of the following triggers. Any changes in regulations and industry best practices, changes based on interactions with the regulator. The trick here is not to only learn from your own engagements, but to monitor articles or findings made against other industry participants and to apply those findings to your organization's processes. Changes in the organization's offering or strategy, and the result of monitoring activities undertaken in the organization. This will not only give you an indication of your staff's willingness to comply with the rules, but also whether the mitigation processes you have developed are efficient and a logical way that makes sense. If your staff keep on being non-compliant in certain areas, it is either because they do not understand the rules, the mitigation plans are impractical, or the consequence of non-compliance is not clear or consistently enforced, and it means that either your training plan, your procedures, or your compliance policy needs improvement. Reviewing the above will assist your organization to continuously answer the following questions. Is our plan working? Have our risks changed? In other words, have we improved the probability or the consequence for organization? Have we expanded or reduced our programs and services? Are changes or updates required as a result of those changed programs and services? Are staff following the risk management plan? Do they need to be retrained on the details? And do we need to better communicate the plan? In my experience from implementing the compliance risk management program across other regulatory question sets, there is a direct link between the outcomes of risk monitoring and review activities to the effectiveness of key decision making across the organization and the continual improvement of the risk management framework. We hope you've enjoyed this webinar and that it has provided you both with a clearer understanding of the requirements of POPI and some practical tools towards achieving and maintaining compliance. Enjoy the rest of the webinar series and all the best for your POPI journey.